Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. There we go. I'm going to start with 3 quick quotes. The first one is by Brian Barrett, who was writing about the Sony hack for Gizmodo. And he said, "The most painful stuff in the Sony cache is a doctor shopping for Ritalin. It's an email about trying to get pregnant. It's shit-talking coworkers behind their back. It's even the harmless, mundane, trivial stuff that make up any day's email load and suddenly feels ugly and raw out in the open. You may assume that you'd be fine in the same scenario, that you'd have nothing to hide, that you wouldn't mind. But just take a look through your sent folders last month, last week, yesterday. There's something in there you wouldn't want the world to see. There's some conversation that would be misread without context or read correctly for its clodishness. Our inboxes are increasingly our id, a water cooler with infinitely expandable memory." The second is by the sociologist Karen Levy, who was speaking at a panel about consent at the network, at IBM last month. And I'm paraphrasing, but what she said was, "We act as though if we are able to develop a technical means around a user's consent, then we have the right to do pretty much whatever we want." The third and final quote is by Keir Weinsmith, who is describing how he and his team think about the work that they're doing around privacy and the implications of their digital work at SF MoMA. And what he said was, "We walk right up to the line of creepy, and then we take 2 steps back." So Paula mentioned that I used to work at Flickr, and when we launched geotagging, we didn't even bother trying to come up with sensible defaults. Instead, we forced users to choose defaults before they could even use the feature. First, they had to choose a default privacy setting for all their geotagged photos. And secondly, they needed to expressly tell us that if a photo had GPS information embedded in the EXIF, that we should import it. So this was back in August of 2006, about 6 months before the iPhone was even announced, and another 6 months before it hit the market. And the idea that GPS information would be embedded in people's photographs hadn't really been normalized yet. So one of the consequences of this decision was that as other photo sharing websites became more popular, notably Instagram, many of them didn't bother to ask users whether they wanted them to do this. So as if by magic, suddenly everyone's photos were geotagged, and it was pretty cool. And consequently, everyone thought our geotagging features were broken. So it's important to keep in mind that this was, 2008, right? That was the year that the then NSA director Keith Alexander said, "Actually, why don't we just record all the signals?" Right? It's a reasonable question. And so people were pretty excited by the opportunities that these tools and all this data presented. There are 2 things that people always do with photos outside of telling stories about them. One of them is they write the date on the back, and the other one is they write where they were taken. And so if your tools can take care of that for you, and then you get all the follow-on services around that, that's kind of awesome. And it's not like we weren't excited about geotagging. We were just trying to be mindful of the implications of what people were about to start doing. But being mindful of those implications and actually conveying those implications to people are 2 different things. And we did a pretty bad job, I think, of conveying them to people. And again, 2008, no one really believed that the internet could be hoovered up and just sort of wrapped up in a bundle. It was too big. That was the idea. So if any of you have ever posted a photo to Flickr and given it a Creative Commons license, you may not be aware that when you do that, you trump the other setting on the website that disallows people from downloading your original photos. Surprise. So even if you've said that you don't want people to see the original photos, and even if you've said that you don't want people to see your geotagged information, because remember, unless you opt out now, all of your photos are geotagged by default on your phone. the license setting still takes precedence. And I mention this because I worked there for 5 years and I didn't even know this. Or rather, I had just assumed that we had an order of precedence for this sort of thing. It may have changed after I left, I don't know. And if we ever had a cardinal rule at Flickr, it was don't fuck with people's photos. And that included the metadata. We wouldn't have gotten rid of the metadata even if you had asked us to. So in a world where you might be able to imagine something like a national security letter, right? You could imagine the breadth and the scope of it, maybe not the sort of liberal application that apparently it has been given. You might consider what we did a feature. In a world where you could imagine a junior lawyer drafting an argument to say that algorithmic face detection, by virtue of its automated nature, should simply be considered just metadata, like all the time and location information in your photos. Yeah. So one of the burdens of the present is that we are all forever being forced to pay the cost of someone else's near future opportunity. The core of the opportunity myth, at least in this country, is a celebration of someone seeing value in something that no one else has recognized or understood yet, and in reaping the reward of extracting that worth. Now, we can argue about it, but that's pretty much the states. So in legal circles, there's something called the exclusionary rule, which doesn't seek to prevent the collection of data by making it a physical impossibility, but achieves the same end by nullifying its admissibility in court. It is a very real example of a community and a society saying to itself, 2 + 2 = 5. What it says is the manner in which cause and effect are established is in fact more important than the fact being proved. So most people know the exclusionary rule by its umbrella principle, which is the Fourth Amendment or the right to privacy of the US Constitution. Right now, the manner in which the exclusionary rule is applied to big data is a mess. One court, the Supreme Court, has said that no, the police can't just put a GPS unit on your car and track you as you, I'm totally not going to do 1 minute, but it's fine. We can't do GPS units on cars. On the other hand, another court has said the police can totally go to the phone company and just take all the location data that they've collected from your phone. No one's quite sure how the exclusionary rule will apply to national security letters, but the Australian government has solved this problem by simply legislating that anything that the surveillance infrastructure captures is admissible in court. And there is a whole other debate to have about Europe's right to privacy laws, and I mention them only in passing because they might be the closest thing we have that kind of looks like an exclusionary rule for big data. And so in the meantime, absent our ability to craft narratives and social norms in step with the instrumentation of our lives, right? Everything is being instrumented, everything is being recorded. The resultant big data will remain a bountiful frontier of opportunity, anyone to see the implications of their actions as tomorrow's problems. So this is really the core of it. And I'll jump straight to the point. I work at a museum. I work in the digital team. We've been spending, and it's a design museum. We've been spending a lot of time trying to think about how we collect digital things, how we collect design where design is increasingly becoming ephemeral. There is no tangible form anymore, but there's clearly something there. So the example that we use a lot is the Nest thermostat. So in 2013, we acquired a couple of them. We took them out of their boxes and we put them on the shelf. And you know, we're the Smithsonian. We will totally take care of those thermostats forever. We also acquired prepared some sketches and prep drawings for them. And arguably, those drawings are more important in the long run because when we acquired the Nest, I don't think we even turned them on. We don't have the source code. We don't have any of the data that a Nest collected. We have no way to talk about what it is. What separates it from the sort of classic T68 round Honeywell, which seriously, like, we have both of them just stuck to a wall right now on display, right? So it would have been unfair of us to ask Nest to give us their source code. They sold the company for $3 billion a couple months later, right? And that's the same for any commercial concern. So the question is, what does it mean for a museum, for the cultural heritage sector, to think about escrow for intellectual property and, by extension, for the data that those products create? What would it mean for individuals and corporations to have a way to set up a social contract with a cultural heritage institution to say, I will give you this data? And the important part is that I feel like it is safe in the present, in the moment. I know. Because there's an awkward thing. I mean, the cultural heritage sector there's a problem right now that no one really wants to admit to, which is that we share more in common right now with organizations like the National Security Agency than anyone quite knows how to conceptualize. Every time someone talks to you about personal informatics or like census data from 17th century London or wherever, understand that the NSA is trying to solve the same set of problems. And if you replace the number of miles you ran or the color of your baby's poo with the question of original sin, with the question of motive, that's basically what they're doing. And it sounds a lot like what cultural heritage does, what scholars do. They try to look back and figure out, what does it mean? What were they doing? I used to have a lot of conversations with people. Okay. So I'll just leave it at this. There's another slide, but it didn't really make a lot of sense. Okay. The post-conspicuously thing, I'm not sure what that. I saw a permit in a restaurant from the Department of Health, and it said post-conspicuously. And I think that was it's this idea that these are social issues. The reason I said that 2 + 2 = 5 is the problem I have with the rhetoric of big data right now is that it's a rhetoric of the law of the jungle. It's a rhetoric of inevitability. And the law of the jungle only gets us so far. We've been trying to crawl our way into some other alternative ever since we've been able to identify it as such. And I wonder if museums and the cultural heritage sector, by virtue of the fact that we have mandates, right? The Smithsonian is yours. Whether there is a way to try and help the present, to protect the present from itself. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Fine. Thank you. Lee, you want to?